Kentucky 1894, the family who lived and died inside their own bloodline. This is not a legend whispered in the dark corners of Appalachian taverns. This is documented history, a case so disturbing that local authorities tried to bury the records for decades. Afraid of what the truth would reveal about the cost of isolation and the forbidden unions that shaped an entire lineage, in the remote hills of eastern Kentucky, where the autumn of 1894 painted the landscape in shades of amber and crimson, there existed a family whose name has been deliberately erased from official documents. For the purpose of this investigation, we will call them the Holloway family, though their real identity remains sealed in the archives of Breathitt County. What happened to them is a testament to what occurs when bloodlines turn inward, when family trees cease to branch and instead twist back upon themselves in an unholy spiral. The Holloway homestead sat 15 miles from the nearest settlement, accessible only by a narrow dirt path that wound through dense forest and across two shallow creek beds. The main structure was a weathered two-story cabin built in 1847 by the family patriarch, Elijah Holloway, a man who had moved his wife and 3 children to this isolated location, seeking what he called independence from the corruptions of town life. What began as a desire for self-sufficiency transformed over 4 decades into something far more sinister. By 1894, the Holloway compound housed 17 individuals across 3 generations, all living in that same cabin in 2 smaller outbuildings constructed from rough-hewn timber and fieldstone. But these 17 people shared a genetic heritage so intertwined that medical professionals who would later examine them struggled to create an accurate family tree. Brothers had married sisters. First cousins had produced children who then married their own first cousins. Uncles had taken nieces as wives. The bloodline had become a closed circuit, electricity running through the same wires again and again until the system began to overload. The first outsider to witness the true nature of the Holloway family was a traveling physician named Dr. Samuel Pritchard. In late September 1894, Dr. Pritchard had been summoned to a neighboring farm to treat a case of typhoid fever. On his return journey to the town of Jackson, his horse threw a shoe near Holloway Creek. Following the sound of an axe splitting wood, he made his way through the forest toward what he hoped would be assistance. What Dr. Pritchard encountered that afternoon would haunt him for the remainder of his life. In his personal journal, discovered in 1957 in the basement of a demolished medical office, he described the scene with clinical precision that barely masked his horror. "I emerged into a clearing where a cabin of considerable age stood in poor repair," he wrote. Working near the woodpile was a young man, perhaps 20 years of age, though his physical development suggested severe abnormality. His head was disproportionately large, with a pronounced protrusion of the forehead that gave his face a distorted appearance. His eyes, set too far apart, wandered independently of each other, and his jaw receded so severely that I wondered how he could properly chew food. When he attempted to speak, only guttural sounds emerged, though he seemed to understand my request for assistance. Dr. Pritchard's arrival at the Holloway homestead coincided with a family gathering for the midday meal. What he witnessed inside the cabin defied his medical training and challenged his understanding of human genetics. Around a rough-hewn table sat family members displaying a constellation of physical deformities that he had never seen, concentrated in a single bloodline. 3 children ranging in age from 5 to 12 exhibited what we now recognize as severe cranial abnormalities resulting from generations of consanguineous unions. Their skulls were misshapen, some with pronounced bulges at the temples, others with flattened occipital regions. 2 elderly women, presumably the matriarchs of the family, had facial features so compressed and asymmetrical that Dr. Pritchard initially thought they were suffering from some form of progressive disease rather than genetic inheritance. But it was the youngest infant, perhaps 6 months old, that revealed the true depth of the family's genetic catastrophe. The child, held by a young woman who appeared to be both its mother and the niece of the man seated beside her, had been born with what Dr. Pritchard described as a face lacking the basic architecture of human proportion. The eyes were positioned at different heights on the skull. The nose was little more than a small protrusion with irregular nostrils. The mouth could not fully close, and a constant stream of saliva ran down the infant's chin. In his journal, Dr. Pritchard noted with barely concealed anguish, "I have attended medical lectures on the dangers of cousin marriage, but the theoretical warnings of my professors could not have prepared me for this living exhibition of genetic collapse. These people are not suffering from disease or injury. They're suffering from their own blood, poisoned not by outside contamination but by its own purity, its own refusal to accept new material. They are a family consuming itself from within. Dr. Pritchard repaired his horse's shoe with the help of the young man at the woodpile and departed the Holloway homestead before nightfall. But the images he had witnessed would not leave him. Upon returning to Jackson, he confided in the county sheriff, a stern man named William Baxter, who had heard rumors of strange folk living in the deep hills but had never investigated the claims. What Dr. Pritchard told Sheriff Baxter was more than a medical curiosity. He described a family structure that violated both the laws of nature and potentially the laws of Kentucky. The young woman holding the deformed infant appeared to be no more than 15 years old. The man he had seen her interact with, who showed her affection that exceeded familial bounds, was clearly much older, possibly in his 40s, with the same receding jaw and wandering eyes that marked him as part of the same twisted lineage. "We must investigate," Dr. Pritchard insisted, "not as a matter of curiosity, but as a matter of public health and moral duty. These people are trapped in a cycle that is destroying them, body and soul." Sheriff Baxter was reluctant. The hills of eastern Kentucky in 1894 were governed by an unspoken code. What happened on a man's property was his own business, provided it did not spill into the towns. Isolated families were common in these mountains, and many of them practiced what polite society chose to ignore. To interfere would be to open a door that many preferred to keep closed. But Dr. Pritchard would not be dissuaded. He began documenting everything he had observed, creating detailed sketches of the physical deformities and writing extensive notes on the family's living conditions. He consulted medical texts from the Johns Hopkins Hospital and corresponded with colleagues in Philadelphia and Boston who had studied the effects of inbreeding in European royal families and isolated religious communities. The responses he received confirmed his worst fears. Consanguineous unions, particularly over multiple generations, created what one Boston physician called a genetic whirlpool. Harmful. Recessive traits that would normally be diluted in a diverse gene pool instead became concentrated and amplified. Physical deformities were merely the visible manifestations. Mental impairments, organ malformations, weakened immune systems, shortened lifespans. These were the invisible costs of a closed bloodline. By early October, Dr. Pritchard had compiled a report substantial enough to force Sheriff Baxter's hand. On October 18, 1894, Sheriff Baxter, accompanied by Dr. Pritchard, his deputy, and 2 county officials, made the 15-mile journey to the Holloway homestead to conduct what was officially recorded as a welfare investigation. What they discovered that day exceeded even Dr. Pritchard's grim expectations. Confira CJO inscrito nes canal, porcus historias q revelamos, aqui snoas verdis qa historia tentu in errari voca navi quirer, perdero proximo. Capitulo desta investigaco. The morning of October 18, 1894, dawned cold and gray over Breathitt County. Sheriff William Baxter led his small party through the winding forest trail, each man silent with apprehension about what they might encounter. Dr. Pritchard had prepared them as best he could, but there are some realities that words cannot adequately convey. They arrived at the Holloway clearing shortly before noon. The homestead appeared even more dilapidated in the harsh light of day than it had during Dr. Pritchard's first visit. The main cabin's roof sagged dangerously in the middle. One of the outbuildings had partially collapsed, its timbers rotting from years of neglect. Chickens wandered freely through the yard, and the smell of human waste mixed with wood smoke hung heavy in the cold air. The family had been alerted to their approach by the sound of horses. By the time Sheriff Baxter dismounted, a group of adults had emerged from the cabin, their expressions ranging from confusion to hostility. The man who appeared to be the family's current patriarch stepped forward. His name, they would learn, was Joseph Holloway, grandson of the original Elijah Holloway and the product of a union between first cousins. Joseph himself displayed the markers of his lineage. His jaw protruded slightly and his left eye drifted toward his temple when he tried to focus on the sheriff. But compared to some of the other family members, Joseph appeared almost normal, a devastating commentary on the spectrum of deformity present in this bloodline. "What business brings the law to my property?" Joseph demanded, his speech slurred but comprehensible. Sheriff Baxter had prepared a careful response. "We've received reports of concerning living conditions, Mr. Holloway. As county sheriff, it's my duty to ensure the welfare of all citizens, especially children and those who might not be able to care for themselves." The confrontation that followed was tense but not violent. Joseph Holloway understood that he had little choice but to permit the inspection. To resist would bring more attention, perhaps even military intervention from the state capital. And so reluctantly he allowed the officials entry to the family compound. What the inspection revealed was documented in a report. filed with the Breathitt County Court on October 25, 1894. The original document, written in Sheriff Baxter's careful handwriting, still exists in the Kentucky State Archives. Though it was not made publicly available until 1962, the main cabin housed 12 individuals sleeping in 4 rooms. There were no separate quarters for adults and children, males and females. Family members slept together in arrangements that defied conventional understanding of familial boundaries. Dr. Pritchard noted the presence of a woman approximately 30 years old, who shared a sleeping area with a man identified as both her uncle and the father of her 3 children. The children themselves, ages 8, 6, and 3, exhibited varying degrees of physical abnormality. The 8-year-old boy could not walk properly due to legs that bowed severely inward. The 6-year-old girl had a cleft palate so pronounced that her speech was unintelligible, and she drooled constantly, unable to control the muscles of her mouth. The 3-year-old appeared to have some form of severe cognitive impairment, unresponsive to his name and unable to perform basic tasks expected of a child his age. In the second outbuilding, they found 5 more family members, including 2 elderly individuals who appeared to be siblings and who had produced 2 children together decades earlier. These middle-aged offspring, now themselves in their 40s, showed signs of what Dr. Pritchard suspected was premature aging caused by genetic defects. Both had lost most of their teeth by age 40. Both suffered from chronic respiratory problems that left them wheezing and weak. One had developed what appeared to be early-stage dementia, unable to remember conversations from minutes earlier. But the most disturbing discovery was made in a small room at the back of the main cabin. Here, isolated from the rest of the family, they found a young woman approximately 17 years old. She was in the late stages of pregnancy, her belly swollen beneath a stained dress. When Dr. Pritchard attempted to examine her, she recoiled in fear, pressing herself against the wall and making high-pitched keening sounds. The woman's face bore the unmistakable markers of the Holloway bloodline: eyes set too wide, a severely recessed chin, a forehead that bulged unnaturally. But she also bore other marks, bruises on her arms and the distinctive pattern of finger grips, evidence of rough handling. Pritchard gently lifted her sleeve. He found more bruises, some fresh, some faded to yellow and green. "Who is responsible for this woman's condition?" Dr. Pritchard asked Joseph Holloway. Joseph's response was matter of fact, devoid of shame or recognition of wrongdoing. "That's my daughter, Esther. She's carrying my grandchild. The father is my nephew, her first cousin, Thomas. They'll be married once the child is born, as is our custom." The casual admission hung in the air like poison gas. Sheriff Baxter, a man who had witnessed considerable violence and depravity in his years enforcing the law, found himself momentarily speechless. The practice Joseph described was not merely consanguineous marriage, it was a systematic pattern of interbreeding that had been maintained for decades, possibly generations. Dr. Pritchard pressed further, his physician's instincts overriding his revulsion. "How many pregnancies has Esther had?" "This will be her 3rd, Joseph replied. "The first child died within days of birth. The second lives but is simple-minded, unable to care for herself. She's with the other young ones in the side room." The investigation continued for 3 more hours. Dr. Pritchard examined as many family members as would permit it, documenting 17 cases of significant physical deformity, 12 cases of apparent cognitive impairment, and 5 cases of what he termed compound defects, individuals suffering from multiple severe abnormalities affecting different body systems. He measured skull dimensions and recorded them in his notebook. He noted the prevalence of dental problems, with most adults having lost teeth by their 20s. He documented respiratory issues, digestive problems, and signs of weakened immune systems. Several children had scars from infections that had healed poorly. One young man, perhaps 19, had a partially paralyzed left arm, the result of a childhood injury that had never properly healed due to what Dr. Pritchard suspected was a genetic bone disorder. The county officials, meanwhile, documented the living conditions. The cabin had no proper sanitation facilities. Water was drawn from the creek, the same creek into which the family's waste was deposited. Food storage was inadequate, with dried meat hanging in the open air, exposed to flies and vermin. The children appeared malnourished, their ribs visible through thin clothing. But perhaps most damning was the evidence of the family's genealogical structure. In a trunk in the main room, Joseph Holloway kept a family Bible that dated back to 1847. Inside, written in various hands over the decades, was a record of births, marriages, and deaths. When Dr. Pritchard examined this document, he found confirmation of his worst suspicions. The Bible recorded multiple marriages between first cousins. It documented unions between uncles and nieces. There were notations suggesting that some individuals had produced children with multiple family members. The family tree that Dr. Pritchard attempted to construct from this information was less a tree than a tangled net. Lines of descent crossing and recrossing until the very concept of distinct lineage became meaningless. As the sun began to set on October 18th, Sheriff Baxter made a decision that would alter the course of the Holloway family forever. Based on the evidence of neglect, the condition of the children, and the ongoing pattern of unions that violated both natural law and human decency, he declared the homestead unfit for habitation and the children in need of state intervention. Joseph Holloway protested, but his protests were weak. On some level, perhaps, he understood that what his family had become was unsustainable. The bloodline had reached a critical point. Without new genetic material, without the introduction of outside blood, the family was spiraling toward extinction through its own accumulated defects. The officials departed the Holloway homestead that evening with a promise to return within 1 week with a court order. Joseph was warned that any attempt to flee or hide family members would result in criminal charges. Dr. Pritchard left his medical supplies with instructions for basic care, knowing even as he did so that his medicines could not address the fundamental problem. As they rode back through the darkening forest, none of the men spoke. What they had witnessed transcended ordinary human experience. This was not simple poverty or ignorance. This was the consequence of a family that had chosen isolation so complete that it had consumed itself, generation by generation, until what remained was a collection of damaged bodies housing damaged minds. Trapped in a cycle they could neither understand nor escape, Dr. Pritchard would write in his journal that night. I have today looked upon the face of genetic catastrophe. These people are the victims of choices made long before they were born, trapped in bodies shaped by the sins of their ancestors. They know no other life, no other way of being. To them, this is normal. This is family. This is love. How does one explain to them that the very blood that binds them together is also the poison that destroys them? The following week would bring legal proceedings, medical examinations, and the beginning of an official record that authorities would later try desperately to suppress. But on that cold October evening in 1894, as 5 men rode away from the Holloway homestead carrying the weight of what they had seen, the family remained in their cabin, living as they had always lived, bound by blood in ways both literal and terribly, tragically metaphorical. The court proceedings began on October 26, 1894, in the Breathitt County Courthouse, a modest brick building that served as the center of legal authority for the region. Judge Cornelius Whitfield presided over a case that had no clear precedent in Kentucky law. How does one prosecute a family for the crime of their own genetics? How does one separate victims from perpetrators when every individual is both? Dr. Pritchard presented his medical findings to a courtroom, packed with curious townspeople who had heard rumors of the deformed family in the hills. His testimony was clinical, detailed, and devastating. He described each physical abnormality he had documented, explaining in layman's terms how consanguineous unions over multiple generations created a concentration of harmful recessive traits. When cousins marry, Dr. Pritchard explained, they share a portion of their genetic heritage inherited from common grandparents. Any defective traits carried by those grandparents have a significantly higher chance of manifesting in the offspring when this practice continues for generations. With the gene pool becoming smaller and smaller, these defects become not just common but inevitable. The Holloway family has been breeding within itself for so long that they have essentially created a separate genetic line, one that is collapsing under the weight of its own flaws. The prosecution, led by County Attorney Marcus Thornton, argued that Joseph Holloway and other adult family members should be charged with contributing to the delinquency of minors and maintaining a household injurious to public morals. But this legal strategy immediately encountered problems. Many of the unions that had produced the most severely affected children had occurred years or even decades earlier. The statute of limitations had expired on most potential charges. Moreover, the family members themselves seemed genuinely unaware that they had done anything wrong. When Joseph Holloway took the stand in his own defense, his testimony provided a window into a worldview so isolated and self-contained that it seemed to exist outside normal society. My family has lived in these hills since my grandfather's time, Joseph stated, his wandering eye making it difficult for spectators to know where he was looking. We have always married among ourselves. My grandfather married his first cousin. My father married his niece. I married my second cousin. This is our way. We do not trust outsiders. We do not want their interference. Our blood is our blood, and we keep it pure. The word pure hung in the courtroom like an obscenity. What Joseph Holloway called purity, everyone else recognized as contamination, not from outside sources, but from the family's own refusal to allow any outside source. Judge Whitfield pressed Joseph on specific cases. The young woman, Esther, who was found pregnant, she is your daughter? Yes, sir. And the father of her child is your nephew, her first cousin? Yes, sir. Thomas is a good boy. He will care for her and the child. Mr. Holloway, you understand that marriage between first cousins, while not strictly illegal in Kentucky, is strongly discouraged by both medical professionals and religious authorities. Joseph's expression remained blank. I know only what my family has always done. The defense attorney, a young man named Robert Chun, who had been appointed by the court, attempted to argue that the Holloway family was a victim of its own isolation and ignorance. These people have lived apart from society for so long that they have developed their own customs, their own understanding of family. They are not criminals. They are casualties of geography and circumstance. But Dr. Pritchard's testimony had already sealed the case. The medical evidence was irrefutable. The family's practices had resulted in demonstrable harm to children, to individuals who had no choice in the circumstances of their birth. Whether through malice or ignorance, the result was the same: suffering. On November 2, 1894, Judge Whitfield issued his ruling. The Holloway homestead was declared unfit for habitation. All children under the age of 16 were to be removed from the family's custody and placed in state care. Adult family members who were determined to have the mental capacity to live independently would be permitted to leave, though they would be monitored. Those who were severely impaired would be committed to the Kentucky Institution for the Feeble-Minded in Frankfort. The family's response to this ruling was a mixture of confusion, anger, and heartbreak. They did not understand why the state was taking their children. They did not comprehend how their way of life, which had seemed natural and normal to them, could be considered wrong by outsiders. The separation occurred on November 8, 1894. Sheriff Baxter returned to the Holloway homestead with a contingent of deputies and state officials. What transpired that day was documented in several sources, including newspaper accounts from the Jackson Times and letters written by one of the social workers involved in the removal. The children cried and clung to their parents. The parents, many of them cognitively impaired themselves, could not understand the explanation given to them. One mother, a woman of perhaps 25 whose face bore the distinctive Holloway features, collapsed on the ground wailing as her two daughters were carried to a waiting wagon. The girls, ages 6 and 9, both showing signs of physical deformity, screamed for their mother in voices distorted by cleft palates and malformed mouths. An elderly woman identified as Martha Holloway, the matriarch of the family and the daughter of the original Elijah Holloway, stood in the doorway of the cabin and spoke words that several witnesses recorded. You are taking our blood, she said, her voice surprisingly clear despite her age and condition. You are breaking the circle that has kept us together all these years. You think you are saving these children, but you are killing our family. We are nothing without each other. We are nothing without our blood. Her words proved prophetic in ways she could not have imagined. 17 children, ranging in age from 6 months to 15 years, were removed from the Holloway homestead that day. They were transported to various institutions across Kentucky. The youngest and most severely impaired went to the state hospital in Frankfort. Those with moderate physical deformities but apparent cognitive function were placed in orphanages in Lexington and Louisville. A few of the older children, those who seemed capable of learning and integrating into society, were placed with foster families willing to take on the challenge. The outcomes varied dramatically. Of the 17 children removed, detailed records survived for 12. 4 died within the first year of placement, their weakened immune systems unable to cope with the diseases they encountered in institutional settings. 3 remained institutionalized for life, their physical and cognitive impairments too severe for independent living. 2 were adopted by families and lived into adulthood, though both suffered from chronic health problems. 3 simply disappeared from the records, their fates unknown. Meanwhile, the adult members of the Holloway family who remained at the homestead began to deteriorate rapidly. Without the structure that had sustained them, without the younger generation to care for, the family seemed to lose its reason for existence. Joseph Holloway himself died in March 1895, less than 5 months after the children were removed. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but those who saw him in his final weeks reported that he seemed to have given up on living. The pregnant young woman, Esther, gave birth in December 1894 under the supervision of a state-appointed midwife. The infant was born with severe deformities, including a malformed heart and lungs that could not properly oxygenate the blood. The child lived for 18 hours, struggling for each breath before passing away in his mother's arms. Esther herself never recovered from the psychological trauma of losing her child and being separated from her family. She was committed to a psychiatric facility in early 1895 and died there in 1899. At the age of 22, from what the records describe as failure to thrive, Dr. Samuel Pritchard continued to follow the case, visiting some of the institutionalized children and corresponding with the families who had taken others in. What he observed troubled him deeply. While some of the children showed improvement in controlled environments with proper nutrition and medical care, they never fully integrated into normal society. They were marked, both physically and psychologically, by their origins. One foster family wrote to Dr. Pritchard about a 10-year-old Holloway boy they had taken in. Little James tries so hard to be like the other children, but he cannot help what he is. His face marks him as different, and the other children are cruel. He asks me sometimes why God made him this way, why his family lived as they did. I have no answers that bring him comfort. How do you explain to a child that he is the product of choices made before he existed, that his suffering is the result of love twisted into something destructive? In his later writings, Dr. Pritchard reflected on the ethical complexity of the intervention. "We saved the children from a life of continued isolation and genetic deterioration," he wrote. "But we destroyed the only family structure they had ever known. We tore them from parents who, despite their limitations, loved them in the only way they understood. We told them their family was wrong, their blood was poisoned, their very existence was a mistake. What kind of salvation is that? I need you to comment something right now. Type these exact words below this video. Their blood was their prison." If you felt the weight of this tragedy, leave that comment so I know you understand what we are witnessing here. By 1896, 2 years after the initial intervention, the Holloway case had attracted attention beyond Breathitt County. Medical journals began publishing articles about consanguinity and its effects, often referencing the Kentucky family without naming them directly. Dr. Pritchard's detailed documentation became a resource for researchers studying human genetics, a field still in its infancy in the late 19th century. The scientific community's interest in the Holloway family was not purely academic. In the 1890s, the eugenics movement was gaining momentum in America and Europe. Proponents of eugenics believed that human populations could and should be improved through selective breeding, preventing those with undesirable traits from reproducing. The Holloway case became a cautionary tale used to support various eugenic policies, from marriage restrictions to, in more extreme proposals, forced sterilization. Dr. Pritchard found himself in an uncomfortable position. His documentation had been intended to help the family, to bring attention to their suffering and secure state intervention for the children. But now his work was being cited by individuals advocating for policies he found morally repugnant. In a letter to a colleague in Boston, he expressed his dismay. "I fear that the suffering of the Holloway family is being exploited to justify cruelties against others." Yes, their situation demonstrates the dangers of extreme consanguinity. But this does not give us license to play God with people's lives, to decide who may or may not have children based on some arbitrary standard of genetic fitness. Nevertheless, the scientific study of the Holloway family continued. In 1897, a team of physicians from the University of Louisville traveled to eastern Kentucky to conduct follow-up research. They examined the remaining adult Holloways, took detailed measurements, and created photographic records. These photographs, disturbing in their clinical objectivity, were preserved in medical archives and used for decades in genetics textbooks. The photographs revealed the full spectrum of genetic catastrophe. One image shows 3 siblings, ages ranging from 25 to 35, all displaying severe facial asymmetry. Another captures an elderly couple, both products of uncle-niece unions, their bodies twisted by bone disorders that made movement painful and difficult. A particularly haunting photograph shows a young woman, barely 18, holding an infant who would not survive its first year. The woman's face is turned toward the camera, her eyes set at noticeably different heights on her skull, staring, with an expression that could be interpreted as either defiance or resignation. The researchers published their findings in the American Journal of Medical Science in 1898. Their article, titled "Observations on the Effects of Prolonged Consanguineous Reproduction in an Isolated Population," became one of the most cited papers on human inbreeding in the early 20th century. The authors concluded that the Holloway family represented a natural experiment demonstrating what happens when genetic diversity is eliminated from a breeding population. Over 4 generations, the article stated, this family maintained a closed genetic system with devastating consequences. Common recessive traits became ubiquitous. Deleterious mutations accumulated unchecked. Physical deformities appeared in nearly every individual. Cognitive impairments affected the majority. Infant mortality exceeded 70%. Those who survived to adulthood faced shortened lifespans plagued by chronic health problems. The family was, in essence, experiencing genetic collapse, a phenomenon previously observed only in isolated animal populations. The researchers also noted something that Dr. Pritchard had documented but not fully explored: the psychological effects of the family's isolation and genetic burden. Several of the Holloways displayed what we would now recognize as symptoms of severe depression and anxiety. They spoke of feeling cursed, of believing that their family was being punished by God for some unnamed sin. They described nightmares and disturbing thoughts. One woman told researchers that she sometimes looked at her children and felt a fear so deep it stopped my heart, though she could not articulate what she feared. This psychological dimension added another layer of tragedy to the Holloway story. Not only were these individuals suffering physical consequences of their genetic heritage, but they were also aware, on some level, that something was profoundly wrong. They could see their own abnormalities reflected in their children and grandchildren, each generation more damaged than the last. But they lacked the knowledge or resources to break the cycle. Isolation had become both their prison and their identity. By 1900, only 7 adult Holloways remained alive. The homestead had been abandoned, the cabins falling into ruin. Those who survived had scattered, some to nearby towns where they lived on the margins of society, others to institutions where they would spend their remaining years. The family as a cohesive unit had ceased to exist. One of the survivors, a man named Benjamin Holloway, was interviewed by a local historian in 1903. Benjamin was 32 years old but looked 50. He walked with a severe limp due to deformed leg bones. His speech was affected by a cleft palate that had never been repaired, but his mind was relatively clear, and he spoke with painful honesty about his family's fate. "We thought we were protecting ourselves," Benjamin said. "My grandfather used to say that outsiders brought disease and corruption, that our family was special, chosen by God to remain pure. But we weren't pure. We were poisoned by our own blood. Every child born into our family was a gamble, and we kept losing. I've buried 3 children of my own, all born wrong, all suffering. My wife, my first cousin, I'd trying to birth our 4th child. The baby died too. I am the last of my line, and when I die, there will be nothing left of the Holloway name except the stories people tell to frighten each other." Benjamin Holloway died in 1907 at the age of 36 from complications related to respiratory disease. He had no surviving children. With his death, the direct male lineage of the Holloway family ended. But the genetic legacy persisted in unexpected ways. Some of the children who had been removed from the homestead in 1894 had children of their own. These second-generation descendants, while raised outside the closed family system, still carried the genetic markers of their Holloway heritage. Medical professionals who tracked these individuals noted that even with the introduction of new genetic material through marriages with non-relatives, certain physical traits persisted: the tendency toward facial asymmetry, the high incidence of dental problems, the elevated risk of cognitive impairments. Dr. Pritchard, who continued to follow the case until his death in 1919, observed that genetic damage accumulated over multiple generations could not be quickly reversed. "The Holloway bloodline has been marked," he wrote in one of his final papers. "Even as it disperses and dilutes into the broader population, it carries with it the scars of its history. Future generations may be healthier than their ancestors, but they will never be entirely free of the burden." The scientific community's understanding of genetics advanced significantly in the early 20th century. The rediscovery of Mendel's laws of inheritance in 1900, the development of chromosomal theory, and eventually the discovery of DNA structure in 1953, provided frameworks for understanding exactly what had happened to families like the Holloways. Researchers could now explain in precise terms how recessive alleles accumulated, how genetic load increased, how inbreeding depression manifested in human populations. But for the Holloways themselves, this scientific knowledge came too late. The damage had been done across generations before anyone understood the mechanisms at work. They were casualties of ignorance and isolation, their bodies the evidence of natural laws they had unknowingly violated. In 1925, Kentucky passed legislation restricting marriages between close relatives, citing the Holloway case among others as justification. First cousin marriage, while not banned outright, required special permission and genetic counseling were available. Uncle-niece and aunt-nephew unions were prohibited entirely. The law came 3 decades too late to help the Holloways, but it reflected a growing understanding of the dangers inherent in consanguineous reproduction. The Holloway homestead itself remained abandoned for decades. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, squatters briefly occupied the main cabin, but they reported feeling uneasy there and left after only a few weeks. Local legend grew around the property, transforming the tragic reality of the Holloway family into something more sensational. People spoke of ghosts and curses, of deformed creatures still living in the woods, of blood that called to blood across the years. These legends obscured the truth that the Holloways were not monsters or victims of supernatural forces, but ordinary people trapped by circumstance, geography, and a fatally flawed understanding of family. Their tragedy was entirely human, entirely preventable, and entirely devastating. The last known survivor with direct memory of the original Holloway family died in 1954. Sarah Brennan, born Sarah Holloway in 1889, had been 5 years old when the family was broken apart by state intervention. She had been placed with a foster family in Lexington, given a new surname, and raised to forget her origins, but she never did. In her final years, living in a modest apartment in Cincinnati, Sarah agreed to be interviewed by a graduate student researching the history of Appalachian families. The recordings of these interviews, preserved in the University of Kentucky archives, provide a first-hand account of life in the Holloway compound and the trauma of its dissolution. "I remember my mother's face," Sarah said, her own face bearing subtle signs of her genetic heritage, slightly asymmetrical features, widely spaced eyes. "She was beautiful to me, though others called her deformed. She had a smile that made me feel safe, even when I was hungry or cold. When they took me away," she screamed. I can still hear that scream 60 years later. "They told me I was being saved, that my family was sick, that our blood was bad, but I was a child. All I knew was that I wanted my mother." Sarah described the confusion of being thrust into a world completely different from the isolated homestead. Everything was wrong, she recalled. The food tasted wrong. The clothes felt wrong. The people looked wrong because they looked normal, and I had never seen normal before. I didn't know how to talk to other children. I didn't understand their games or their jokes. I was an alien in their world, marked by my face and my past. She spoke of the shame that followed her throughout her life. Even after I married and had children of my own, I never told them where I came from. My husband knew, but we agreed to keep it secret. I was terrified that my children would be born like my siblings, with the deformities that marked our family. By God's grace, they were healthy, but I watched them constantly for any sign, any hint of the Holloway curse. The last known survivor with direct memory of the original Holloway family died in 1954. Sarah Brennan, born Sarah Holloway in 1889, had been 5 years old when the family was broken apart by state intervention. She had been placed with a foster family in Lexington, given a new surname, and raised to forget her origins, but she never did. In her final years, living in a modest apartment in Cincinnati, Sarah agreed to be interviewed by a graduate student researching the history of Appalachian families. The recordings of these interviews, preserved in the University of Kentucky archives, provide a first-hand account of life in the Holloway compound and the trauma of its dissolution. "I remember my mother's face," Sarah said, her own face bearing subtle signs of her genetic heritage, slightly asymmetrical features, widely spaced eyes. "She was beautiful to me, though others called her deformed. She had a smile that made me feel safe, even when I was hungry or cold. When they took me away, she screamed. I can still hear that scream 60 years later. They told me I was being saved, that my family was sick, that our blood was bad. But I was a child. All I knew was that I wanted my mother." Sarah described the confusion of being thrust into a world completely different from the isolated homestead. Everything was wrong, she recalled. The food tasted wrong. The clothes felt wrong. The people looked wrong because they looked normal, and I had never seen normal before. I didn't know how to talk to other children. I didn't understand their games or their jokes. I was an alien in their world, marked by my face and my past. She spoke of the shame that followed her throughout her life. Even after I married and had children of my own, I never told them where I came from. Sarah's testimony revealed something that official records could not capture: the psychological inheritance that outlasted the physical one. The trauma of being torn from her family, the shame of her origins, the fear of genetic contamination, these invisible wounds shaped her entire life. She was saved from the physical fate of her relatives, but she carried the emotional burden until her death at age 65. By the 1960s, the Holloway case had become a footnote in medical history, referenced occasionally in genetics textbooks but largely forgotten by the general public. The homestead in eastern Kentucky had completely deteriorated, reclaimed by the forest that had once isolated it. The creek still ran through the property, indifferent to the human tragedy that had unfolded on its banks. But the lessons of the Holloway family remained relevant throughout the 20th century. Researchers continued to document cases of genetic disorders caused by consanguineous unions in isolated populations around the world, from the royal families of Europe to remote island communities. The pattern repeated. When bloodlines closed in upon themselves, the consequences were always devastating. Modern genetic science has confirmed what Dr. Pritchard could only observe empirically in 1894. We now understand the precise mechanisms by which inbreeding increases the expression of harmful recessive alleles. We can measure genetic diversity through DNA analysis. We can predict with reasonable accuracy the health risks faced by children of closely related parents. We have tools that the Holloways never had, knowledge that might have saved them from their fate. Yet even with this knowledge, consanguineous marriages continue in some communities, driven by tradition, isolation, or deliberate choice. The Holloway tragedy serves as a warning of what can happen when genetic diversity is sacrificed, when family boundaries collapse, when isolation becomes so complete that a bloodline turns toxic. The final chapter of the Holloway story was written in 1998, when a team of anthropologists and geneticists received permission to excavate the family cemetery located near the abandoned homestead. What they found confirmed the historical records and added new details to the scientific understanding of the family's genetic collapse. The cemetery contained 43 graves spanning from 1847 to 1905. 28 of these were children who had died before age 10. Analysis of the remains revealed the full spectrum of genetic disorders, skeletal malformations, cranial abnormalities, evidence of organ defects. One infant skeleton showed such severe bone deformities that researchers concluded the child could not have survived more than a few hours after birth. DNA extracted from bone samples confirmed the extreme consanguinity documented in historical records. The genetic analysis revealed that the effective population size of the Holloway family, the number of genetically distinct individuals contributing to the gene pool, had been reduced to less than 12 individuals over 4 generations. This level of genetic homogeneity is comparable to severely endangered animal species on the brink of extinction. The research team published their findings in the Journal of Human Genetics in 2001, concluding that the Holloway family represented one of the most extreme documented cases of human inbreeding depression in North American history. The article noted that modern populations with similar levels of consanguinity face comparable health risks, emphasizing the ongoing relevance of this century-old case. Today, the Holloway homestead is unmarked and unknown to most residents of Breathitt County. The family name has been largely erased from local memory, deliberately forgotten by descendants who escaped the genetic and social burden of their heritage. But the story endures in medical archives and genetics textbooks, in cautionary tales told by genetic counselors to couples considering consanguineous marriage. The ultimate tragedy of the Holloway family is that their suffering was entirely preventable. They were not victims of disease or disaster, but of choices made by ancestors who valued isolation over integration, purity over diversity, tradition over the welfare of future generations. Each child born into that closed genetic system inherited not just the physical traits of their parents, but the accumulated damage of generations of inbreeding. In his final journal entry about the Holloway case, written shortly before his death in 1919, Dr. Samuel Pritchard reflected on what he had witnessed 25 years earlier. "I have spent my career treating diseases of the body, but the Holloway family taught me that some afflictions cannot be cured with medicine. They suffered from a disease of blood and choice, of isolation and ignorance. Their tragedy reminds us that we are not meant to exist in closed circles, that human vitality requires diversity, that love turned too far inward becomes its own kind of death. May their suffering not be forgotten, and may it serve as a warning to any who believe that bloodlines can be preserved through isolation. The Holloways kept their blood pure, and it destroyed them." The last grave in the Holloway cemetery was dug in 1905. It belongs to an unnamed infant who lived for 3 days before succumbing to multiple organ failures caused by genetic defects. That child was the final victim of a tragedy that began 60 years earlier when Elijah Holloway moved his family into the Kentucky hills, seeking independence from the outside world. He wanted to protect his family. Instead, he condemned them to a slow genetic extinction that would take generations to complete. The Holloway bloodline did not end with dramatic violence or sudden catastrophe. It simply exhausted itself, worn down by the accumulated weight of too much shared heritage, too little genetic diversity, too many generations looking only inward. They lived and died inside their own bloodline, prisoners of their own blood, victims of a purity that was really poison. Their story is over, but its lessons remain written in genetic code, in medical textbooks. In the cautionary tales we tell about the price of isolation and the danger of boundaries that become prisons. If you watched until here, it's because this story impacted you the way it impacted me while researching it. If you're not subscribed to this channel, do it now, because stories like this, stories that history tried to bury, need to be told. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next investigation into families whose secrets were too dark to remain hidden. If you watched until here, it's because you understood the tragedy we just witnessed together. Leave a comment saying I watched until here, so I can meet you and know who truly appreciates the stories on this channel. Hit the like button if this story made you reflect on how isolation and forbidden choices can destroy entire bloodlines. And share this video with someone who needs to understand that some family secrets carry consequences that echo through generations. The Holloway family lived and died inside their own bloodline. Their tragedy is over, but the lessons carved into their genetic legacy must never be forgotten.